Well, let's get some analysis then on those extraordinary developments in Moscow over the weekend. Our former Moscow correspondent, Elena Volochine, is with me in the studio. Elena, hello to you. Also in the studio, Douglas Herbert, our foreign affairs commentator. Thanks to you both for coming in. Elena, if I can start with you, it has been, as I say, an extraordinary weekend. I wonder this Monday lunchtime where you think things stand at the Kremlin, and if we even know, for example, where Vladimir Putin is.
This is a question impossible to answer. He's probably in a high security place. The situation today is that it's an unprecedented crisis since the fall of the USSR. So the regime is very fragile and is showing all the signs of such. For example, with this statement of Vladimir Putin, who said the regime has to, what it didn't say it like that, but what it means that the regime has to stay and to hold, and that everyone has to be united. We also heard the Russian Prime Minister saying this morning, and this video from Sergei Shoigu, a video without a sound, who is actually the enemy number one, claimed as his enemy by Yevgeny Prigozhin. So today, the fact that this video, which we don't know if it's from today or an archive video, is being shown, is showing that all the signs are here, that the regime wants to show that everything is under control. The Russian state TV channels also, who usually delivers these endless speeches about denazification, the NATO attacking Russia, etc. Since the events, the anchors are sticking to reading to read the communiques, the official communiques. The main Russian state TV news channel round the clock is showing documentary movies about rebellion, terrorists, etc. But they don't talk about the events. This is showing all the signs of a regime who is extremely vulnerable, extremely fragile, and now who is just trying to remain.
Okay, a vulnerable regime. And I wonder, when you were looking at what was happening on Saturday, did you think to yourself, this is an attempted coup d'etat against Vladimir Putin?
Of course, it's the first thing I said when I heard the speech from Prigozhin, the half-an-hour speech. Look, he just said, we are going to go to Moscow. After we finish, all the institutions are going to stay in place. No one should oppose us. Everyone who will oppose us will be killed. We want Shoigu, we want Valery Gerasimov, and basically he said, we are doing a military coup d'etat. I mean, this is what he said without saying it, calling it a little bit later like a march for justice. But I mean, it was so obvious from the speech since the beginning, and I think we should really learn to read between the lines of those kind of characters that are in today's Russia, including Dmitry Peskov when he says something, including Prigozhin, all the officials, including Vladimir Putin. I mean, they are saying things without naming it. We should know it, and obviously what he said was, it's going to be a coup d'etat, and the coup d'etat has failed.
Well, that's really interesting, and let's bring in Douglas Herbert on that, because, Doug, you were actually in Russia in 1991 when there was another attempted coup d'etat, and I wonder whether you see any similarities to what Elena's talking about this weekend and what you witnessed then.
Yeah, quite a few. I mean, first of all, I think let's stress that August 1991, which some people call the Moscow Putsch, was a coup that happened, and then 2 days later it unhappened. That is to say, there was a counter coup led by Boris Yeltsin, who climbed a tank, faced down the putschist, rallied the democratic opposition, which then existed in Russia, to the streets. So a coup that happened and then unhappened. But one direct parallel that I see is, Elena mentioned that the Soviet state propaganda television networks are showing right now documentaries, something that has nothing to do with one of the momentous events in their modern history. Basically, the message, nothing to see here, carry on. Now, I awoke on the morning of August 19th, 1991 in Moscow to a friend shouting in my face, Douglas, военный переворот, which means in Russian, military coup, military overthrow. I bolt out of bed. I'm like, what's going on here? I turn on the television also. That's your first reflex. What do I see? Swan Lake, the ballet, the classic ballet, being played in loop, looping and looping. So today, documentaries, nothing happening here. Back then, Swan Lake. Basically, the Soviet propaganda outlets covering themselves. They had no idea what to communicate, and when you don't know, you don't communicate. For Russians, for Soviet citizens, they were still Soviets, at the time watching that, they knew something big was going on. Swan Lake meant something big is going on. And I will just say that a day before, something big had gone on. 5 black Volga cars had pulled up to the gates of Gorbachev's dacha on the Black Sea coast of Crimea, and out stepped the head of the 9th Directorate of the KGB, along with some high-ranking army officials, along with some high-ranking Communist Party officials, and they knew right away they were there to detain Gorbachev. And that following morning, the morning where they were playing Swan Lake, a new committee called the Gang of Eight, the State Committee for the Emergency Situation, as they called themselves, appeared. 8 gray-suited men appearing on state television to basically announce to the nation that Mikhail Gorbachev, the last president of the Soviet Union, had resigned for health reasons. The rest is literally history. 2 days later, Yeltsin climbs up on that tank, saw off the coup. Gorbachev returned from that detention in Crimea. He remained president of the Soviet Union for about 3 more months because after that, as you know, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. Soviet Union was gone. Gorbachev was gone from power.
So potentially quite a historical parallel. And Elena, you were sort of nodding and smiling as Doug was talking there. And I wonder, do you see history possibly repeating itself? Could this be the beginning of the end of Putin, or is that a bit too far?
Yes, it could be. And I, of course, see the parallel. I was smiling because these memes of the Swan Lake are now pouring out on the Russian social networks. Yes, of course, I join Doug on that. The difference today, I think, is that there is an army, a parallel army, that these people in power, in the security forces who are supporting this, they have this armed arm that can do maybe even worse than what happened in 91, because
this is Wagner.
They are going, yes, and if they manage, they are going to install a junta in Russia, and I mean this is terrible, because this is just an army of criminals, of war criminals, and there is also a war going on. So I would say that today the context is way more even terrible than it was back then, because by that time you would also already have democratic forces in place. It doesn't exist. I mean, like a democratic elan.
Right, exactly.
Yeah,
the democratic opposition
movement, and it doesn't exist in nowadays Russia. This is important to understand about the model that they try to impose to today's Russia. Of course, this is the people who wants to reinstall a system, or to maintain with just another people ruling a system led by Soviet-style security forces. This is the other parallel. The other thing is that you have plus to that, you have Putin's ideology, which is one of an empire. Because when we think that Vladimir Putin is nostalgic from the Soviet Union, he just wants the way of governance of the Soviet Union. But his vision is one of the empire. He said it in his statement yesterday morning that the 1917 revolution was a stab in the back, and he compared Prigozhin's move to this. So we have to bear all this in mind, that yes, of course the parallel is there, but the situation and the forces are even more terrible.
And unfortunately, we only have a minute or so left. Very quickly,
one quick thing I'll just say, just playing off of Elena here. Putin is basically the inheritor of the ideas of the putschists, of their ideology, their hard-line desire to roll back what were then the reforms, the glasnost and perestroika that Gorbachev had initiated, that opening up of the Soviet Union. Putin is much more a direct connect-the-dots line to those putschists than he is to the democratic opposition that saw down the coup of August 1991.
Right, and just a final thought, if I can, from you, Elena. I wonder how you think at this stage the turbulence in Moscow will affect the war in Ukraine.
Well, it could directly affect the war in Ukraine, of course, because we see that now for Wagner, the priority was for one weekend or a few hours or whatever, 24 hours to oust Vladimir Putin. So of course it's going to have an effect on the war. Now we shouldn't think that Yevgeny Prigozhin is the one who would like to end the war in Ukraine. No, he says that Ukraine is Ukraine's inhabitants are ethnical Russians, and he's like the side of the most full scale as possible invasion of Ukraine and like a violent one. But also he's doing war not by ideology but by interest, whether it's financial interest, power interest, but he's not an ideologist. And so this is all going to be about now the forces, who is going to win the force, the bras de fer.
Thank you very much indeed. Elena Volochine for us there, our former Moscow correspondent. Douglas Herbert, thanks to you as well, our foreign affairs commentator. Much more analysis on this, of course, during the afternoon.